Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today's episode is a particularly special one. For many years, I've been trying to determine the answer to a question that has been debated for decades, mostly by physicists. But after careful consideration of the evidence available today, as well as interesting clues that occur when pianos are built different to tradition, I think that I've figured it out. So, today I'm going to give you my hypothesis as to how we change sound color, or as it should be described more precisely, how we change the timbre of our sound. Now, in order to get into this, we first have to briefly consider the question, what is timbre? Let's consider it in its simplest form. What is the difference between a piano playing middle C and a fingernail plucking the same string? Well, we can definitely hear the difference between the two sounds. It's obvious. One sounds like this, and the other sounds like this. For the moment, this difference in sound is what we can define as timbre. The pitch is the same, and the volume to some extent, but the quality of sound is entirely different. They start differently. The piano sound starts a little less harsh and a little less sudden. The piano sound will develop differently to the plucked one, perhaps sounding like it grows a little before decaying, whereas the plucked one will sound like it's always decaying, though slowly. When we deconstruct this scenario, we get down to the real definition of timbre. Timbre is the specific constellation of the fundamental and the partials that exist within a given note. The fundamental is the main pitch that we hear and identify with our ears. For this diagram, the fundamental is a low C. When we play this note, we're not just producing the fundamental. We're actually producing all the partials that resonate above the fundamental as well, each to a different intensity. Embedded in this note is the first partial, which is an octave above, the second partial, which is a fifth above that, and so on and so forth. Now, it's important to understand the partials that exist above the fundamental do not resonate equally in terms of intensity with the fundamental or with each other. Most of the time, the partials are far softer than the fundamental. Furthermore, the partials have the capability of changing their dynamics as the note develops and decays. Normally, the partials will all get softer, but occasionally, individual partials will grow in sound before getting softer. Remember the difference you heard between the piano and the plucked string? Well, both of the sounds have the same fundamental. However, each sound has a different combination of partials above it. Maybe partials 3 and 5 are very loud on the natural piano sound, but almost non-existent in the plucked string. Maybe on the plucked string, the higher partials will resonate louder and longer than the ones produced by a piano sound. Maybe on the piano sound, partial 2 will grow in sound before decaying, whereas in the plucked string sound, partial 2 may simply be heard and then disappear quickly. The point is that the difference in sound that we hear is due to the specific constellation of all of these separate parts resonating together and how each of them develops and decays. This is what we recognize as timbre, and when we hear this total combination of sound, we can determine from experience what instrument or voice is producing it. It's a lot to consider, I know, but we need these definitions to be rather clear in order to explain how we change sound. Think of it like a recipe for a cake. The usual basic ingredients involve flour, butter, sugar, etc., and then the elements that make the cake more specific, like icing or chocolate. Wonderful things. But even these basic ingredients differ in their amounts depending on the cake. We don't always use 2 cups of flour or 4 eggs. And to make matters more complex, the proportions of ingredients to each other can also change depending on the recipe. When we bite into a piece of cheesecake, for most of us, our brains are not attempting to determine how many individual grains of sugar are in it. We can figure it out in general. We can say, this cake is too sweet, or this one needs more salt. But precision does not exist because the elements are all mixed together, and our tongues simply aren't good enough to do a proper analysis. This is very similar to the problem we find with sound. Our ears do not easily identify when certain partials are too strong or too soft. We rely on the composite sound to tell us, this is a trumpet playing. Or more specifically, our sound quality on the piano is too percussive for this singing melody. As you gain in performance experience, you'll find that certain pianos create a sound that you like, and other ones almost fight against you as you try to produce a certain sound. Some pianos appear to us as being overly percussive, and they can be difficult for us to produce mellow sounds or a singing tone for our melody. On the other hand, some pianos are rather mellow all the time, and when we want to play something fast and rhythmic, the piano might feel like it's throwing a blanket or a comforter over our sound, making everything sound muddled. All of this has to do with the envelope of sound that each note produces, how the note starts, how it develops through time, and the rate of decay of sound in the instrument. But the core issue in all of this always comes down to the timbre that the instrument produces, and what we do to control this timbre from the keyboard. Now, let's talk a little bit about what happens when the hammer hits the string on a piano. When we press down a key, we launch the hammer to the string. It hits it and bounces back down to be caught and held until we release the key and play it again. Now, there are lots of things that happen when the hammer hits the string, and it all happens rather fast. When we produce a sound, one element that influences the sound quality to a significant degree is what materials are colliding. Remember when I played the piano earlier and then plucked the same string, and you could hear the difference in sound quality immediately? Well, my fingernail is quite different to the felt hammer, and the method of causing the string to vibrate was very different in both cases. For the moment, let's try something else. The hammer hits the string and bounces back. If I use the metal casing of a pencil eraser for a moment and apply a similar action to the string, then we'll be able to talk about our first important issue. Same kind of action, but different materials. The piano has a felt hammer, and the pencil end is metal. The sound is significantly different, wouldn't you say? Now, this is common sense, even to a child. But let's talk more about why this is happening. In short, metal is hard and felt is soft. If metal hits metal, we get a crash. But if felt hits metal, we get a less percussive, softer thud. The difference is caused by the contact time. When we play metal on metal, the contact time is short because the two materials don't compress very much, and because of a lack of compression and the resultant short contact time, we get a sound that excites many of the partials in the harmonic spectrum. When we play felt on metal, the felt will be compressed slightly by the stronger metal string that it hits, taking some of the energy out of the initial strike, but also increasing the contact time of the two elements during the impact. This dampens some of the partials that we've excited in the string and leads to the sound we are familiar with. Consider it like this. Imagine that these chords represent all the partials of the fundamental note C. When metal is hitting metal, we're getting nearly all the partials excited at once. When we have felt hitting metal, there's some compression and the contact time is increased, leading to some higher partials getting damped out. So, remember this. In general, on the piano, when you have a longer contact time, you dampen out partials, usually starting with the highest and then getting lower as you increase contact time. This change in material that leads to a different sound quality is something that percussionists know intimately. As an example, an orchestral performer who plays the timpani will have several different sets of mallets, each with different heads which are made of various materials which all compress differently. And by changing the mallet, they can adapt the sound they get out of the timpani to suit the music being played. With the piano, we can't change the mallet, so contact time becomes our primary tool that allows us to control sound. Contact time and compression of material are linked on the piano. The more the felt of the hammer compresses, the longer it'll be in contact with the string. The longer it's in contact with the string, the more partials it has the potential to dampen, usually starting with the highest. Piano technicians know this better than anyone. When they are voicing an instrument, they're usually modifying the compression ability of the hammer that strikes each set of strings. Sometimes they have to make the hammer top softer, and sometimes they have to make it harder. If a piano sounds too harsh and percussive, they usually make the hammer softer, using a tool that looks like a needle or pin, which is carefully applied to the top of the felt to slightly loosen the weave of the felt. If a piano is too soft and muddy sounding, they'll make the hammers harder, usually by applying some sort of solution or product to the felt. In general, we know that contact time and compression of the hammer felt is a vital element of the sound production on a piano. But if we as pianists are unable to change the compression rate of the hammer simply by playing a key, then if we wanted to change our sound quality, we somehow have to find a way to change the contact time, right? Well, let's have a look at the action for a moment, because there's something else that you need to know. When we press a key, we're launching the hammer to the string. Imagine that my hand is the string for a moment. Now, the piano action is built with an escapement, which disengages the movement of the hammer from the movement of the key just before the hammer hits the string. If I push the key down very slowly, it stops just before it reaches the string. Normally, we play faster than this, and we launch the hammer to the string with the speed we've built up. If we didn't have this escapement system, then the hammer would get stuck against the string if we held a key down. This leads to our first big point of contention regarding sound quality change. Think about it. In the last little bit of movement, the key is no longer in direct control of the hammer. We cannot manipulate the hammer in the last bit of its travel just before hitting the string. This alone should remove any possibility of us changing our sound quality. Once we no longer have control over the hammer must move according to the speed it attained as it was launched. It'll hit the string and bounce back freely. There's nothing else we can do. This leads to the conclusion that many have come to, which is that because the speed of the hammer influences the volume, the faster you go, the louder the sound is, this would mean that sound quality change only happens on the level of volume, not timbre, and that our perception of sound quality change is an illusion. Well, now I'm going to go into my hypothesis. Now we go into territory that is speculative. The ideas I'm going to talk about are, in some respects, supported academically. The majority of my research in my time in academia was centered around this very problem: understanding sound quality change. It's one thing to be able to achieve it on the instrument to degrees where experienced musicians can hear it as an obvious effect, but it's another to try to understand what could possibly cause it. One of the difficulties, of course, is that it is an effect that is produced by a human. It's not something that can, at this stage, be replicated by a machine. So studying it from a standpoint of traditional scientific research and experimentation is extraordinarily difficult. To make matters worse, the ability to hear the changes in timbre is very much a function of who is listening. As an example, piano tuners can hear without any difficulty the beating patterns of strings that are slightly out of tune. However, most of the general population cannot hear these patterns at all, and may not even know that they exist. But regardless of these challenges, I have what I think is the best and only answer that we can come to today. From now on, we're speculating based on available evidence and experience. Ready? When we play, we launch the hammer to the string, and for the last little bit of its travel, it's unconnected and free moving. Once the hammer is disengaged from the key action, it travels at the speed that it attained by the end of the launch sequence, like throwing a ball in the air. But here's where things get interesting. Do you see this long cylinder that the hammer is attached to? Well, this is called a hammer shank. It's made of solid wood, and it moves on a pivot at its base. Underneath the shank, close to the pivot, is a knuckle. This is the contact point for the action of the key, and it is here that the energy from the key motion is transferred to the shank, launching the hammer. This is very important to understand. When you press a key down, the energy is all transferred through this knuckle to the shank, which throws the hammer at the string. Because the energy is transferred to the knuckle rather than directly transferred to the hammer itself, and because the pivot of the shank is very close to the knuckle, we have what I think is the answer to our question of how we change sound quality. As I mentioned, the hammer shank is made of wood. As a result of its length and its construction, this shank can flex and bend depending upon the forces that are applied to it. This is known and confirmed in piano manufacturing. If the key movement was applied directly to the hammer, then the hammer would only be affected by the speed and acceleration that it was launched at. But the key movement is applied close to the base of the shank, and the hammer is on the far end of the shank. I believe that the shank, in effect, is whipping the hammer to the string. Imagine that this lamp here represents the hammer and the shank. If the shank were not flexible at all, if it were, as an example, made of solid metal, then we would get this kind of action towards the string. However, if the shank is flexible and force is applied to the knuckle, then the shank will bend and flex in the middle as it throws the hammer to the string. This is because the hammer on its end has considerable mass compared with the shank, all concentrated at one point. Because of the bend and flex, the hammer will approach the string at a different orientation than normal. Here's the string, and here's the hammer. Without the shank bending, the hammer hits the string flush, we could say. When the hammer shank bends, the hammerhead is oriented slightly backwards as a result of the whipping action. And when it collides with the strings, it takes a moment to correct the orientation during contact, like this. This increases the contact time, therefore changing the sound quality to become less percussive. The increased contact time dampens out some higher partials and makes the sound less harsh. In my point of view, this is the center of the whole argument. The ability for the hammer to strike the string at a slightly different orientation and with a contact time that can be varied almost independent of the speed at which the hammer is thrown to the string. In other words, the ability for us to control and change sound quality regardless of the volume. This is the first claim that I'm making that is not proven at this time through rigorous experimentation. This is a conclusion I came to from experience and from combining research that has been done in other areas of piano sound. It is the only explanation I have for how the actual timbre can be altered. The hammers stay the same, the materials stay the same, the compression factor at the top of the hammers is reasonably consistent to the point that we won't find a huge difference in sound quality unless we are moving the hammers laterally, like when we use the una corda pedal. So, we're left with a situation where the sound changes, but independent of the speed of the hammer hitting the string. The hammer hitting the string at a different orientation is the only solution to this. There is something I'd like to mention that serves as a slight corroboration regarding how the flexibility of the shank relates to my hypothesis. There have been some piano companies lately that have been experimenting with hammer shanks made of alternative materials. Inflexible metal shanks were used in the first experiments on piano tone conducted in the early 20th century, which produced uniformly percussive sounds regardless of what speed was being applied to them, and which also led to the early conclusion that piano timbre could not be changed at all. Lately, hollow carbon fiber rods have also been used as an alternative for wooden hammer shanks, carbon fiber being very light and very strong. Early versions using carbon fiber seemed to have the same problem as the metal shanks, that because the material was not as flexible and has no give, so to speak, the effect is one of playing on eggshells, where every small movement of the key is translated into a sudden and immediate sound, one which is difficult to vary and control. Something to consider. But now we get to the next problem in my hypothetical explanation of how we change sound quality. If I am right, and the change in sound is dependent upon the flexing of the shank, how do we control when the shank bends and when it doesn't? Surely it would be bent all the time due to the nature of the movement, right? Well, on the initiation of the key movement, the hammer starts to accelerate from a dead stop. This initial movement bends the shank. If we immediately stop the acceleration of the key, then the lack of thrust against the knuckle allows the shank to slow and the hammer to catch up. The hammer is now at its normal orientation, and if there was enough speed at the start of the whole thing, the hammer will hit the string flush and percussive. This is what happens when we play a staccato note in a fast but soft piece. If we want it to be louder, we end up increasing the speed of the initial key movement, but the idea remains the same, that because it's staccato, and because of our movements at the keyboard, we stop accelerating long before the hammer escapes the action. If we want to create a non-percussive singing tone, we do the opposite of all of this. We attempt to maintain acceleration as long as possible, and to do so, we have to start the key much more gradually. When the key movement begins, the hammer shank bends. And if we maintain acceleration as the key goes down, the shank remains bent. If we've controlled the acceleration well enough, then the shank will remain bent when the hammer hits the string, even after the escapement kicks in. This results in the hammer correcting its orientation while in contact with the string, increasing contact time, dampening a few partials, and thus giving us a full-sounding tone, which can be described as rich and not percussive. Let's talk about this for a moment. A short recap. My hypothesis is that we change our timbre on the piano by changing the contact time between the hammer and the string. This contact time is determined by the orientation of the hammer when it hits the string. The orientation of the hammer is determined by the flexing of the hammer shank. Because it is launched near the pivot end, not near the middle or the hammer end, you have a whipping effect where the hammer end is slightly late to the movement, but catches up depending on when you stop the acceleration. If you stop the acceleration early, like when you play a staccato, the hammer catches up to the shank before it strikes the strings, and thus it will strike the strings without need for correction. If you continue the acceleration through the keys, the hammer is still behind the shank, and when it hits the strings, it contacts and corrects for its deviation. This leads to a length in contact time, a dampening of a few partials, and thus a more mellow tone. Just to be clear, it's not about maintaining speed of the descent of the key. It's about maintaining acceleration. Acceleration is what keeps the shank bent, because the increase in speed maintains a positive force on the knuckle. If he simply maintained the speed and not accelerate, then the force on the knuckle drops, allowing the hammer to catch up. The main argument against all of this is that the hammer and the shank are automatically disconnected from the key movements for the last few millimeters before the hammer hits the string. The claim is that because we are no longer able to influence the hammer using direct force in this space, the hammer will automatically reset to its primary orientation before hitting the string. My counter to this is that the time it takes for the hammer to catch up to the shank is longer than the time it takes for the hammer to hit the string in these few millimeters. That is, of course, if we've graded our acceleration correctly. Furthermore, the possibility exists that as the shank corrects itself from being bent, it might bend slightly in the opposite direction before stabilizing, like a taut string being plucked. This would still result in the hammer contacting the string's slightly off orientation, leading to an increase in contact time as it corrects when it hits the strings. So, how do you change your sound? Well, you control the speed that the hammer hits the strings, which determines how loud it is, and the acceleration to get to that final speed, which determines the sound quality. Is the acceleration constant? Is it ever increasing until the let-off point? Is it sudden with a deceleration before the strike? Speed will get you the dynamic level you want, soft or loud. Acceleration will get you sound quality, percussive or non-percussive. If this is true, then what do I think it explains? Well, in short, it can explain everything we currently know about piano technique. The first thing we can think about is all the literature we have that describes from a pianist's perspective how to generate the elusive singing tone. There are many different techniques, some even named after their authors, and when you compare them side by side, you find that the only common thread between them is the ability to control the descent of the key. Some techniques emphasize the use of the upper arms and back. Some emphasize having a flexible wrist. Some even go so far as to attempt to describe concepts of natural weight and the drop of the arm. All of these techniques can't be right, at least if we're thinking along the lines of one way to produce a type of sound. But if my hypothesis is correct, that sound quality change is entirely dependent upon the acceleration of the key, then all of these techniques can in fact be right, to a point. The reason we see so much differentiation between different piano techniques, all aimed towards the same goal, is because the control of the acceleration of the key is dependent entirely on the physical makeup of the person playing the piano. The piano mechanism can be seen as being largely uniform. But since every performer is a different height, with arms and fingers of different lengths and widths, with different musculatures, everyone must use different techniques in order to achieve the same results. This is why there can never be a final solution to the question of how do I play with a good tone. And this is also why there are in fact so many treatises written on the subject, where yet another pianist thinks they've found the answer. What has happened is that these pianists, with good intentions, have approached the problem from the wrong end. They think, I produce this sound using my body this way. If someone else moves their body the same way, then they'll produce the same kind of sound. This kind of thinking makes sense. But when you think about it a little more, you realize that it's faulty because you're trying to apply the same rules to something which is infinitely variable, the human body. In other words, you're trying to make a universal technique for something that is not universally uniform. The piano, on the other hand, is relatively standardized. That's where we need to take the information from. This happens on the piano, and this is how it happens. How do we, as the biological variable, find a way to create the same effect on a standardized instrument. Even the most inexperienced pianist can hear the difference between banging on the keyboard and playing the keys with a follow-through of some kind, pushing the keys down as if you're pushing forward on the instrument. With experimentation, a pianist can learn to hear more subtle changes within these extremes, though they may not understand why the change in sound happens. In my explanation, when we bang on the keyboard, technically, we're abruptly starting the key movement with a very fast downward thrust. But because the acceleration of our movement begins above the key surface, we end up hitting the top of the key with speed, which jerks or bounces the hammer upwards. There is no constant acceleration. There's a short burst of acceleration at the very beginning of the movement, but this drops off immediately because the mass of the key itself stops us momentarily. This drop-off in acceleration means that the knuckle is essentially bumped into motion. Because it's no longer in a constant acceleration, the hammer catches up to the shank, and we get our banging quality of sound. It's like a staccato note, only very loud. When we play into the keys, or play with a follow-through, the keys are, in essence, gradually being pushed downwards. Younger pianists tend to avoid the bottom of the keys because of the feeling you get of coming up against a brick wall. But as they learn about sound production, one of the first things they're taught is to pretend like they're playing through the bottom of the key. When we think about this seriously, what are we telling the student to do? Well, if they try to avoid the bottom of the key, then what is the key doing when they play? It starts accelerating, but then they slow down before the bottom. This let-off of speed means that the acceleration has stopped. The hammer corrects itself, and we get a moderate percussive tone. If the student plays past the bottom of the key, they're continuing the acceleration all the way. With enough speed, they generate a singing tone. This is why it's so elusive to many students. Getting the acceleration just right takes practice. And to make matters more difficult, the way to control this acceleration reliably depends heavily on how the person is built physically. Just because my way of creating this tone works physically, like if I said, play with a relaxed arm, that doesn't mean that that approach will work for someone else. The most frustrating thing for many pianists is that they find that certain fingers will produce a better sound than others, or at least more easily create this sound. To me, that's the most illuminating problem. That tells us that it's the instrument that is what we have to adapt to, that the instrument is the constant, and we are the variable. If our fingers can perform differently depending on their size and musculature, even though they're on the same hand, then how can we expect a complex wrist technique described in a treatise to work for all pianists? Everything you've been taught about how to approach the keys, playing with the fingertips, playing through the keyboard, using arm weight, etc., every technical approach and school, they all exist in order to help us control a single element: acceleration of the key and bending of the hammer shank. This is why there is so much diversity in terms of how professionals approach the keyboard if we limit our observation to their physical movements. There is no right way to play the piano except to control the acceleration. How we control it is up to us. This is also why our primary teacher in terms of sound control must be our ears, not our eyes. To determine how to play the piano by mimicking a professional's movements at the keyboard is in many ways useless, because their movements are a development and product of their individual physical attributes, as well as their choices in sound. If you want to develop this, you have to experiment at the keyboard yourself, trying out many different approaches in order to find the sound you want to produce. The sound comes first, and then when you find it, you practice what you did so that you can reliably produce the sound again. Simple. Not surprisingly, my hypothesis also explains the observation that many teachers have when they are teaching new piano students. When these students are asked to play loudly, they usually produce a percussive loud sound. It's understandable. If a soft sound is produced by playing the key slowly, then a loud sound will be produced when you play it fast. But this is where the thinking stops. Teaching a student how to play loudly with a non-percussive tone is usually a very difficult process. The first step is usually spent helping the student to learn to hear the difference in sound quality, and then the more time-consuming step of experimenting with various body techniques in the hopes of finding one that produces the sound the teacher wishes to hear. If sound production were only linked to the speed of the hammer, then this situation would not occur. We wouldn't have percussive and non-percussive loud sounds at all. They'd be uniform, but different based on the volume, and students wouldn't have a problem playing loudly. Furthermore, acceleration of the key is not considered as something that we learn in the same detail as we learn about articulation or volume. In other words, the priority of many students is to treat the keyboard as a rather sensitive typewriter, where it gives us the correct pitch in the right rhythm, and if we punch it hard or soft enough, we get the right dynamic. Understanding acceleration as its own entity that is separate from our rhythm or dynamics, understanding it as something that we must vary independently of the rest of our concerns. This is what the search for different sound quality is all about. And it's why many older pianists will claim to have spent years to find the sound they want. The reason it takes so long is simple. They're experimenting to find by accident a sound quality they are looking for, and then they are trying to reverse engineer the sound to find out how they created it in the first place. This leads them to figuring out physical techniques to replicate the sound reliably, and then they come to their conclusion about how to produce a singing tone, as an example. All of this is done using the feel of the keyboard combined with our ears. We're comparing the two ends of the equation without focusing on precisely what happens in the middle, the acceleration. Controlling acceleration is a game of adaptation, where you're constantly working with an instrument and adapting to the individual thresholds that exist in each action and in each key. We can predict, to an extent, what should happen, but we really have to take the real-time acceleration information that we get from our ears and fingers and apply it to the next note. This is one of the reasons why playing a melody legato with fantastic sound quality is a lot easier than playing one note beautifully, lifting our hands from the keys, and then playing the next one. We need the frame of reference of the previous key. We need to know if we played it too loud, too soft, with too much acceleration, or too little. Our ears feed us this information, and our tactile senses also tell us what we did, and then we can adjust for it in order to make a better sound on the next note. But this is also why we have a problem getting machines to replicate sound quality change. Or perhaps I should say, we've never built a machine yet that can adapt note by note, hearing the sound quality, analyzing the situation, and applying the necessary changes to the next note to make a better sound. But this is an important thing to think about. How much we rely on the feel of our technique compared with the sound we create. Why do you think so many technical manuals for achieving great sound quality are all written from the perspective of how it feels or what our body does? Controlling sound quality is pure adaptation at the highest level of concentration. This is why it changes from piano to piano. This is why we need time to try an instrument before performing. This is why we need an instrument that is well regulated so that each note responds in exactly the same way as its neighbor. It's so that the key movement becomes predictable. If it's predictable, we can grade our acceleration with precision, and we have reliable frames of reference to help us adjust our technique to play future notes. In other words, we have to play a note in order to know where the acceleration threshold for that instrument sits. Only then can we begin to change our sound quality reliably and with control. Acceleration is not a constant in this situation, it's just a force, and the amount of force required is different for each piano. That's the problem. Think about it like this. It's like riding a bicycle up a hill with the intention of building up enough speed so that you can coast to the top for the last, say, 20 meters. You won't be able to grade it properly during your first try. It might work, you might overshoot the top, or you might undercut the top. The point is, you need a few goes at it so that it's reliable and consistent. Now, you've perfected one hill. That's one piano. When you move to another piano, you're moving to a different hill. You can use some of your past experience with the first hill to know how fast to go before you can coast to the top. But you still have to adapt and tailor your athleticism to the new hill in order to be accurate. This is what it's all about, and this is why machines will have a very hard time replicating sound quality control and change. Not only do we have to know what sound we want, but we also have to know how to change our acceleration on a new piano in order to get the same result. That's the tough thing. As a last thought, when we are doing a sound check at a performance venue and we try out a new piano, it's a very rare thing to play one that reacts exactly as we would think according to our past experiences in practicing. We always have to adjust slightly to get the sound we're used to hearing. With volume, this isn't really the case. To get something loud or soft is relatively easy on any instrument. But our sound quality always requires a little more time and experimentation. And it's in fact one of the reasons why certain pianists will tour with their own piano. They are used to the feel of the keys, how these keys react to their fingers. But more importantly, they know how to precisely accelerate the keys to produce the sound they want. When we sound check, that's what we're learning to do on the new instrument. We're learning where the acceleration curve is and how much or how little we have to do in order to get the hammershanks to respond. So, that's it for this very important episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing and think about how you accelerate the key. If you can control that element, then you can control your sound. Bye for now.